Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, December 20th, 2019. Don't really have a whole lot of time, so let's see how short I can keep this. I finished one book, Modern Lovers by Emma Straub, which actually, again, I resorted to audiobook just so that I can take that extra time when I can't read a physical book. I feel like this went down as I thought it would, really. This is competent literary fiction about, the ennui of middle age, except with people who used to be famous and are still kind of rich. But I don't know, in the wake of The Wongs versus the World, which I read last week, this didn't really live up, so it's like most of the literary fiction I read. I think I really liked it, but it wasn't necessarily all that special. And the premise is, I guess, around the early 21st century or sometime nearish to now, we have these old friends who are living in gentrified Brooklyn. And they used to be in this band together, and one of them wrote this song which had some huge staying power. And one of the members of the band bought it and turned into this huge celebrity who then had a big peak of, rock and roll, heroin lifestyle, and then she died. So she's sort of this Cobain-style celebrity from the 90s. And there's this movie studio that wants to make a biopic of her life, and they're trying to get the rights from these band members for the song and for, well, I guess not for the song, because technically this person had owned the song and, bought it, but at least for their likenesses within this movie. And one of the members, the male member, has some issues with it. The two female members are okay with it. Otherwise, we're following them through their mostly-ish, normal-ish, middle-aged lives. The woman who wrote the song is now a real estate agent, and she's married to the male member. So these are Elizabeth and Andrew, and he is a trust fund baby who doesn't actually have a job or anything, so he's sort of more unusual. Then the third living member of the band is Zoe. She is a lesbian in a rocky marriage. She is co-owner with her wife of a restaurant, and thinking maybe they're just staying together because of, having this project together. And they, meanwhile, these couples have two children who've known each other and grown up together all their lives, Henry and Ruby, who are now like teenagers. One of them has just graduated from high school but doesn't have plans for what to do next, and they start sleeping together. So yeah, I feel like the teenagers in particular, they grew on me with time, but to a certain degree they didn't exist beyond the needs of the plot of the story. I just found myself thinking a lot about, well, Straub put a little bit of this in there. Like, they went to this, posh private school for their entire lives, but their social lives seemed pretty shallow to me. But I think part of that was some of Straub's commentary about the age and how, especially for the girl who just graduated, just how, things don't last, kind of. And I kind of liked, the ennui stuff. I feel like there were a lot of truisms in here about what it is to be alive, especially in middle age. I think she did better with that personally than with the teen stuff. But the interesting part of the story was the more unusual part. It was the part where, they actually had some mild celebrity and knew this woman, Lydia, who was part of their band and then took their song and became crazy famous. And then there's this whole thing about Lydia, like what type of person she was, and for the most part it seems like she was just a conniving bitch, basically. But with all of this emphasis on her life story and everything, I just was curious because, Straub would keep going back in time a little bit. There was a lot, it was exposition heavy. And so I started thinking to myself, what if this was more like The Interestings by Meg Wolitzer, where we start when they're young, and chronicle it in real time rather than, all this heavy exposition stuff, and talk about what it was like to be that age, pre fame for one of them and just pre kind of normal life for the rest, normal-ish life for the rest, and then go into their middle age, and then it would feel less like all this exposition stuff, and then she could really flesh out this interesting kind of backstory about what it was like to be in a band that actually had this artistic flame, and what type of person Lydia really was, because I don't know. I mean, maybe it was more interesting this way about what her legacy is to these people, but I don't know. After a while, it's like, oh, she's just a big bitch. I don't know. It just felt lackluster. So yeah, I guess I have some mixed feelings. Overall, I think it's the type of book, I really liked it. I liked it a lot. I just feel like maybe in a way I'm being harder on it just because I read the Wongs versus the World or Fleischman is in Trouble recently, and their writing styles are so much more innovative, and I don't know, maybe I'm having a Britta Bowler moment where I want to be more of a Windows reader. I don't know, because there were such different things talked about in that book than there was in this one. I felt like this was pretty well-trod ground, and I can like that when it's done well, and I liked all the ennui stuff about, what it is to be, middle-aged and all that, but it was just this weird juxtaposition because their lives were relatively unusual, really. So I felt like maybe she should have leaned into that a little bit more. And here's my weekly update on this book, On Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore by Eric L. Goldstein and Deborah R. Weiner, which I've been reading for several weeks. It's kind of ridiculous how long I've been reading this. But I am filming this pre-Friday, so I'm hoping later today, as this video goes up, I will actually be finished with this. We'll see how it goes, but at least, I'm definitely I'm in the final chapter and all of that. So yes, I am indeed in the 20th century at last. I think this is the stereotypical time of Jewish history, the time I think most people really think about when it comes to Jewish history, or at least people involved in the community, because by pre-war, the immigration has been capped off, partially by design by the U.S. government, who, as more and more immigrants come in, there's more xenophobia about immigrants coming in, and this is when sort of the anti-Semitism of capping admissions and not letting Jews move into certain, neighborhoods or country clubs. That's when that sort of stuff really takes off, because now there's enough Jews that might be interested in that sort of thing. It's also a time period where I think in the beginning of the interwar period especially, there were schisms, especially around the older immigrants, which are called the German immigrants, because they, for the most part, Central European Jews came earlier, versus the Russian immigrants, or the Eastern European immigrants, who generally came later. They have largely different paths when it comes to Jewish expression, and especially to how they assimilate into American culture, because, the economy and the social mores are different, in these swaths of decades. But by, I think, the later interwar period, even though there are still the German and Russian Jews, which in Baltimore I think were the uptown and downtown Jews, I think they were still more solidified as a community, as one community, than they might have been before, just because there were so many of them. I think the Holocaust and starting to speak up against that kind of helped. Also the Great Depression, which sort of solidified a lot of the Jewish political shift to the left and progressivism and New Deal politics, and it's sort of like writ large about taking care of the community because it's sort of a shifting time, I think, in part of American society about. Beforehand, things were less centralized by the government, and communities took care of their own through charities, but this is the time when Jews and other groups realized that it's just not enough to deal with, poverty and other social issues that were coming to the fore. This is also a time when different factions of Jewish religious and social life from, Orthodox versus Reform or Zionism and socialism are definitely more fortified and more ideological than I think they were before. Speaking of Baltimore specifically, I think the fact that it is a conservative city kind of keeps coming up. It's a strange thing to think about Baltimore, and I think it's making me like rethink the reality of situations in my birth city. But it is a more religious city than many, because it's more southern than many urban centers. We're more to the south than most of them, and that certainly shifted what types of Jewish expression were more popular here. Like Zionism was certainly more popular than the anti-religious socialism, that sort of thing. We're also name-dropping the cool names by now, more and more, like Henrietta Sold, who started Hadassah, the women's Zionist movement. Even Philip Glass, whose father owned a musical store of some sort during the days of continued Jewish store owning, which actually is kind of tapering down, but I love Philip Glass as a composer. Meanwhile, actually, in the interwar years, Jews are becoming more professional. I mean, it kind of helped, I guess, especially during the Depression, apparently, to, instead of starting businesses that might flail, to stay in school. So now suddenly Jews are becoming more of the professional class, as they can, because of these quotas and everything. But as always in these history books, you can't get away from just sort of the debilitating racism against African Americans, which is just sadly a cornerstone of American culture, and the idea of whites trying to keep their supremacy in politics and economy especially, and doubling down on a lot of racist policies, which Jews were mostly keeping in line with, again, to sort of be able to keep their status as whites. There was some, pushback, and I don't know, it's like it's a back and forth that I think they're trying to talk about the complexity of the issues in Baltimore, where actually there was a sizable Jewish and African American community living in close quarters, so that sometimes they actually got along a lot better and helped each other out, especially the Jews helping the disenfranchised African Americans. But sometimes the Jews stayed in line with the segregation and other policies as well, so there could be a lot of frustrations and tensions, which I'm thinking about a lot because it seems like it's flailing up in New York lately, especially with Hasidic Jews in the African American community. There's been violence, especially against Hasidic Jews lately. So yeah, that's where I am. Hopefully all this rambling will lead to a decent, nice Goodreads review. Wanting to sound like I have the smarts when I'm talking about nonfiction and social history. Speaking of nonfiction and social history, next on the docket, I think starting early next week, I want to start reading Beyond CHRISMUKKAH, The Christian-Jewish Interfaith Family in the United States by Samira K. Mehta, which I've been especially excited about because I come from an interfaith family, and particularly entrenched or heavy on a Jewish cultural side of things, and I want to read about how interfaith life has especially impacted the American Jewish community, just from that particular angle, to see what seems similar and what seems different, and just to see myself within literature, and of course it's the appropriate time because next month is both Christmas and Hanukkah, so hopefully I can get to this and read through it quickly. I would like. I don't know, the Jews in Baltimore book has proved to be relatively dense, but it'd be nice to get through something a little faster. And finally, I've just read a couple of stories in here so far, but this is Oedipus in Brooklyn and Other Stories by Blume, Lempel. These are translated from Yiddish by Ellen Cassedy and Yermiyahu, Ahron, Taub. This is, an author plucked from yesteryear, although, actually she lived much more close to the modern day. She died within my lifetime. But she basically, her life spanned the 20th century. She and her family were immigrants to the U.S. She moved briefly to France, and a bunch of her family actually ended up in France as well, where she married, and then she and her husband were able to get out before the Holocaust, but a lot of the rest of her family perished in the Holocaust. So I was reading the intro, and that colors a lot of her fiction. This is a collection of several short stories, and I really hope to tackle a lot of it this weekend because I'm hoping to read the final 8 as part of a Hanukkah short story collection project that I've been doing these past several years, or couple years, where I read and discuss one short story per each night of Hanukkah, and Hanukkah's starting on Sunday night. For a short story writer, I sometimes struggle with reading collections of short stories. Maybe just because they're so short, and I read so many novels especially, and you can take your time kind of getting into them, but you can't do that as much with short stories. But I can already tell from the first 2 I've read, she really has a particular style that I think they're talking about, this sort of blunt force style. And I feel like if I stop worrying about how long it takes me to get through things, I feel like I'm just trying to rush so much through reading before the end of the year. If I could just give myself into these stories, I think I could really enjoy them. Here's a passage from the first story in this collection, Even the Heavens Tell Lies, where the protagonist is a Holocaust survivor, and there's just this sharp trauma to the piece. Apparently, Lempel writes a lot about taboo subjects elsewhere as well. Maybe one of the first to write about Holocaust pain. She also writes in this story a little bit about rape, or in other stories as well about those sort of taboo subjects. But in this section, her narrator is talking with an old friend called Rosa. This is after the Holocaust, after she's survived it. We talk late into the night until morning. We talk and we talk about Israel, about the pioneers who are there now and those who are planning to go. We burn with the passion of speeches made in the great synagogue. Even if we can't grasp the situation with the British, we believe the fiery words of the speakers. We're part of the fire sweeping through our world, the lava and the mouth of the volcano. We believe in the blue and white flag and the Hebrew songs, the agricultural training and the survival of our people. We believe. When I crossed the ocean, I carried with me the habit of speaking to the shadows, and it became my way of life. I look up at the stars that were extinguished long ago. For me, they still shine with that first fire of creation. I don't care that the heavens tell lies. I accept the fantasy along with the fact. I'm not looking for truth. I'm seeking the faith that I've lost, a way out of the chaos, a place where my broken self can put down roots. I know the evil powers that live within people and make no attempt to cloak them in pretty words. I don't separate myself from the community, but I live on the sidelines, like a stranger in my own world. I live with the snakes and the scorpions, with the black leeches in my brain and my blood. I live with the garden in my backyard. Among the stones I carried with me, flowers grew. I refer to them by the names of those who are no more. They burn like memorial candles, each in its season. My parents, who were killed in winter, emerge from the snow, their tart red berries reaching up like blood-soaked fingers. I watch as the hungry birds peck at the berries one by one. My mother's white fingers seem to hold out fruit for the birds. I like to think she enjoys having them eat from her hands. The first bloom that breaks through the winter crust is named Rosa. She appears as a narcissus, white, slender, and shy. The snow may lie at her feet, but she tolerates the bitter weather, bestowing the rich perfumes of her pure soul upon the wind and holding her head high, stretching up with youthful exhilaration. Sometimes she lasts for a day, sometimes for a week, but the bulb stays planted deep in the earth. She will return, and she knows I will be waiting. So yeah, we'll be continuing with this for the next week or so throughout Hanukkah and hoping for good things. So that about covers it for me now. Given the state of my battery on this camera, I think I've been talking longer than I hoped to, which maybe seems to be my way. At least hopefully that means I have a lot to say about books. Meanwhile, I have another weekend coming up. And I think I'm also going to dedicate a significant portion of this one to writing. Like a lot of people who went through NaNoWriMo, I think I've seen a little bit of a precipitous decline in my writing this month. And I would like to get a move on some projects. That being said, I've continued to meet every week so far with, well, the people I know is the DC Rimo group, but actually they're part of another writing group that meets on Wednesdays at a Panera in DuPont. And it just happens that, a couple of them participate in Nano, so they open the doorways to new people to join during November. And so I just have kept coming, and I'm starting to get to know a couple of the people. It seems like they're mostly romance writers, which is cool and different for me. I'm like, I'm writing the least popular genre ever, the literary fiction novella, and trying to dip a little into fantasy. So I'm glad I'm continuing to do that, although my writing still seems to be going kind of slow. And tonight, as I'm filming this, I actually listened to another AuthorTube write-in with the people I used a lot in my vlogs, By the Brook and Natalia Lee and Amberlynn, and so that was kind of helpful too. But now it's late, and I gotta get to bed and post this in the morning. Hope you all are having a great start to your Fridays and your weekends. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.